All right, let's unpack this further then. We are now joined via Zoom by human rights attorney Richard Spoor. Very warm welcome to you, and thanks for joining us here on SABC News, sir.
Good afternoon.
All right, let's talk about what your thoughts are on all of this and where South Africa really does find itself. I mean, no doubt we're a signatory to this statute, and one would assume that we're obliged to act a certain way, especially now in this case where an arrest warrant has been issued by the ICC. What have been your thoughts on all of this?
Well, it seems clear to me that a constitutional crisis is threatening. This issue has been comprehensively canvassed in 2016 with the president of Sudan, Omar al-Bashir, who visited South Africa. There followed litigation to ask about whether or not he was, whether the South African government should have arrested him, which they didn't. And the Supreme Court of Appeal ruled that they ought to have arrested him. I cannot see the South African government arresting Vladimir Putin. I think the diplomatic implications of that are just too large. Yeah. But what I do anticipate is that prior to any visit, people will approach the court, and on the law as it stands, the fact that we're signatories and party states to that treaty, the fact that we've passed laws committing ourselves to the implementation of that treaty, the fact that our constitution binds us to implement the international treaties that we party to, means that it will be possible for somebody to approach the court in advance of his arrival here and ask for an order to compel the government to issue a warrant for his arrest, or even for the court itself to issue a warrant for his arrest. Yeah. And that's going to put the courts and the government in a fundamentally contradictory position. Yeah. The only way out, as I can see it, is to withdraw from the ICC, which has consequences in its own right.
Yeah. Yesterday I was listening to Minister Nosiwe Mapisa-Nqakula, and she was touching on what you've also sort of touched on now, which is, the diplomatic implications that you talk about. You say that they could be large, and she said, we haven't even figured out what the implications of an arrest would be. What do you see those implications possibly being? I know that Nosiwe Mapisa-Nqakula reflected on, the implications not only being for Africa, but also by and large for the African continent. When we're talking about implications, we've heard people talking about war, for instance. I mean, could it go that far?
It's inconceivable that we would arrest Vladimir Putin. I mean, we've adopted a neutral stance to this war. Yeah. The underlying sentiments are certainly on the part of the government are sympathetic towards Russia. We cannot arrest a head of a major world power in South Africa. It just would not happen. Even if our courts stipulated, as I think they're bound to do, that we ought to carry out such an arrest. And that would mean that the South African government would face a choice, comply with its legal and constitutional obligations and arrest Vladimir Putin, or come into direct conflict with an order from our constitutional court, the highest court. I don't think we've ever faced a crisis of this nature. I think some very smart thinking is required, and personally I don't see an alternative than for South Africa to withdraw from the ICC if it wants to avoid this kind of crisis. We've threatened it before, we've withheld, but otherwise we're heading for a very bad place.
You say that, and I hear you very well, that it is almost inconceivable, the idea that, we would arrest President Putin. But, why would the ICC put us in this, sort of position where, a country like ours to arrest, basically a superpower, the president of Russia? Why would we be put in such a difficult position, as you say, clearly quite inconceivable?
Well, the ICC is a court. I mean, it's a court with an international jurisdiction. It's established with the support of 160 nations. 120 of them have become party members to this thing. It's law, it's binding, and it's not for the court to adjust its judgments and its rulings in the interests of politics or diplomacy. And the court, the ICC, has made rulings on this point on several occasions. Look, our view, that is the ICC's prosecutor's view, is that Putin is guilty of war crimes, and in particular the deportation of children out of the war area, and he must be arrested. They think there's a case against him. And the ICC, like any other court, will not subordinate its legal obligations to political considerations. So I don't think the ICC has much choice in the matter. They must do, and their judges must do what they have to do, just like any other superior court.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier that, you know, you see a sort of constitutional crisis looming. How would we overcome that sort of constitutional crisis if and when it does appear? But on the back of that question, I want to talk about, you know, the withdrawal of, you know, being a signatory to the Rome Statute. How, and you know, you did say it, you know, we've tried it, we've threatened before. How difficult or easy is it for South Africa to do so? I mean, it's also starting to cause diplomatic problems for us, as it seems.
You can find a political justification for it. There have been contentions in the past that the ICC is biased, that it favors certain countries and discriminate, you know, it's afraid to rule against large powers, and it discriminates against Africa in particular, because many of the suspects who've been arrested, tried, indicted by the ICC are from Africa. And there is a strong argument, a political argument anyway, that we ought to withdraw. I personally don't believe there's a great deal of merit in that. I think our constitution obliges us to support these kinds of international conventions, and it would be a sad day if we do withdraw. But the options, frankly, are either disinvite President Putin or withdraw from the statute. Otherwise, we're going to be confronted with this impossible situation. I may add that it is possible, through very clever and sophisticated lawyering, to argue that this case could be distinguished from the al-Bashir case. The SCA doesn't close that possibility. So a third possibility is that the South African government preemptively approaches the Constitutional Court for an order confirming that the president of Russia enjoys some kind of diplomatic immunity, and in terms of our public international obligations, we cannot arrest him. And conceivably, arguably, the state might be successful in making such an argument. But if it can't make such an argument, we are confronted by this constitutional deadlock and crisis.
All right, interesting indeed. We appreciate you giving us your time and input there, Mr. Richard Spoor, who is indeed an attorney, a human rights attorney, chatting to us there on the back, of course, of that conundrum, I suppose, South Africa faces at the moment as to whether or not to arrest Putin if he does indeed arrive in South Africa.